Did the Nazis start with deportation? A lesson in how abusive authority built its power in Germany, one law and propaganda piece at a time. So here is our resistance dispatch of the day. Okay, saying that the Nazis didn't begin with mass murder, they began with deportation, as a number of you have commented, is close, but it's wrong in a way that actually, I think, obscures the more important truths about how abusive authority functions, and thus how we can effectively resist it. And this is part of my work in resistance history, evolving into resistance studies, to understand the nature and scope of abusive authority and how people evolve in their movements against it. The Nazis didn't start with deportation. They started with law and engineered social consent over a long period. What made the Nazi regime so devastatingly effective wasn't how fast it moved or how quickly it moved towards abrupt measures like deportation. It's how gradually it tightened its grip. So from 1933 onward, Hitler's government systematically used legislation, propaganda, a key element of this, and bureaucratic enforcement to redefine who counted as German, who deserved rights, and who could be cast out of the national community. And that was the toxic fusion of propaganda and law, designed to weaponize the existing anti-Semitism in German society and make it policy. And that's how anti-Semitism becomes state policy, not just a social prejudice. So April 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Think about these parallels in the language, though. Think about how all of those executive orders are phrased. The 1933 law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Why does it need to be restored? Because Jewish people are in it. You restore it by getting Jewish people out of it. It's the first major legislative act to exclude Jews, banning them from civil service. Not about public safety, of course, about defining who belonged, who in fact was a legitimate part of the representatives of the people in civil service. Then you still have to leap for another year and a half until we get to 1935 and the infamous Nuremberg Laws. There's a Reich citizenship law and the law for protection of German blood and German honor. Again, go back to these executive orders. Those stripped Jewish people of their citizenship. It reclassified them as state subjects outside of the definition of citizenship. The 14th Amendment doesn't protect you because we're reclassifying you outside of it. And they outlawed both intermarriage and sexual relations between Jews and Germans. So before this, you could be Jewish and German. After this, you can't. It meticulously codifies racial discrimination and establishes a legal framework for segregation based upon laws in the United States. And then in 1937, 1938, you go another year and a half, 2 years, and there's a wave of decrees that bar Jews from practicing law, medicine, or business of any kind, which systematically dispossesses them and isolates them economically. There were no deportation trains in 1933. There weren't even concentration camps for Jews yet. There was the rule of law, rewritten, weaponized, and enforced through courts, police, bureaucrats, and Germans complied because it all looked legal on paper. But it was a normalization of exclusion that made the unthinkable gradually appear legitimate. So what about deportation? Yes, the first forced emigrations came after Kristallnacht in November 1938, a state-orchestrated pogrom that marked a significant escalation of violence. But those weren't mass deportations in the sense that people now imply. Those were a violent push to force German Jews to leave the country, seizing their property. Thousands were arrested. Maybe as many 30,000 were arrested and sent to Dachau or Buchenwald temporarily as leverage to pressure them to immigrate. And many fled if they could, often leaving everything behind. But the Nazis didn't initiate systemic deportations of Jews out of Germany to the east, to ghettos and later extermination camps, until late 1941, until after Operation Barbarossa, well after the war had begun, and the apparatus of mass murder was being constructed. And even then, German Jews, while eventually targeted, were not the primary victims of the early massive deportations. That distinction matters immensely, as it speaks to the nature and scope of abusive authority and, crucially, how resistance must adapt. So in Germany, that process of dispossessing and dehumanized Jewish citizens was primarily a legal and social process for years. The genocide had to wait until the populace had accepted the legal and social erasure of their neighbors. And that required a profound internal reordering of society's moral compass, aided by unrelenting propaganda. In the occupied countries, however, Poland, the Baltics, the Netherlands, and others, to varying degrees, we can talk about it, deportation often began quickly and tragically meant immediate murder. Jews were rounded up, packed onto trains, and sent directly to ghettos or extermination camps. This was a different context, where the Nazi regime was an external conquering power, not one that had to gradually erode the rights of its own citizens. And that reveals a critical aspect of authoritarianism. The strategy for implementing abusive power often differs depending upon whether the target group is seen as an internal population to be re-engineered or an external population in conquered territory to be eliminated. And this is a major distinction with a kind of thinking within abusive authority. Are you internal or are you external? If you're external, you're an other that can be wiped out. If you're internal, it needs to be conditioned for you to get in a position to undermine and then either push out through forced emigration or otherwise target to go ahead and erase you from the society. So the lesson for us, particularly through the lessons of resistance studies, is this. They didn't start by throwing people onto trains. They started by making it legal to treat some people as less than citizens by making it culturally acceptable to other them. This was the first critical step in weaponizing anti-Semitism through this toxic fusion of propaganda and law, and we see this over and over and over again in abusive authorities. When you say they started with deportation, we're skipping the part that looks most familiar to us now, the normalization through bureaucracy and the erosion of civic norms. We're skipping the part where people told themselves it wasn't that bad because it was happening in courthouses, not in camps. We're skipping the part where neighbors kept their heads down because the laws weren't targeting them. By the time systematic deportation came for German Jews, it was too late for most people to understand or meaningfully resist what they had already allowed to happen through silence and compliance with legal abuses. So no, they didn't start with deportation. They started with definitions. Who's German? Then restrictions. Who can work? Who can marry? Then exclusion. Who can own property? Who can be a doctor? Who can be a lawyer? Then silence. Who will speak up? Then deportation. Who will be removed? Then death. But it's that early part when it still feels like politics or new laws or policy that we, as students of resistance, have to see most clearly. That's where the initial opportunities for intervention exist, which is why it is valuable to make these comparisons between 1930s Germany and the 2020s United States, before the permission structures for unspeakable acts are fully cemented.